Welcome to an all-new episode of the McFuture Podcast. I'm Steve Faktor, and this is part 3 of the capitalist solution to universal healthcare. This episode is titled, Would You Trust a Schizophrenic? Even though I'm about to offer a solution in the next episode, now it's not the only solution, but it's one that I think could work given our circumstances, I'm still extremely conflicted about government intervention. And you should be too. I know a lot of people have chosen a team and they've kind of digested their platform whole. It's kind of like a python digesting a deer. You've got that giant lump in the middle of it. All I ask is you just leave a little tiny pocket of air for Bambi to breathe for just a few minutes. I'm hardly impartial here. It wasn't until I graduated college that I knew health insurance even existed. What I did know is my 3 grandparents who immigrated here from the Soviet Union were always in and out of hospitals. And only my grandfather ever worked in this country until a few strokes and heart attacks basically turned him into Gary Busey. I don't mean that to be a joke. He literally became catatonic. He'd repeat the word leadership in Russian over and over again and watched nothing but Baywatch and Knight Rider religiously. I don't know what it is about David Hasselhoff, but that guy sustained my grandfather for many years, so I'm grateful. As immigrants, there was no way that my parents could afford healthcare for my grandparents. That means somebody out there subsidized us. And I want to let them know how much I also wanted a pony. I never got it. What I did get was way better. Not only did government assistance give my grandparents Section 8 housing and food stamps and Medicare, but it gave them life. Without that coverage, my grandmother wouldn't have been able to buy me that used Grease soundtrack on cassette. I was the only kid who knew all the words to Beauty School Dropout. Without government assistance, I wouldn't have learned how she escaped from the Nazis, carrying my infant father across Russia. And I'd never get to hang out with my other grandmother in the city after one of her many Broadway matinees. She was quite the adventurer. She dated a guy for many years and never told him how old she was because she was afraid he would leave her. It was weird when my mom would show up and she was fully grown. I think she might have told her she was her sister. Anyway, our society gave me something priceless. And I want to give back. That's how functional societies function. It's never been a 1-to-1 ratio. It's always been this pay it forward model. It's always redistributive, whether it's Jesus feeding the poor or food stamps. But you're not here for my touching rendition of Beauty School Dropout. You want to be penetrated by proof, ravaged by research, to be facted like you've never been facted before. It's pretty obvious that our employer-based system is a mess. I've laid that out in the last episode. But if Obamacare was Frankenstein's monster, Trump, Ryan, Cassidy, Graham Care is the human centipede of healthcare, a long line of redigested turds. At the same time, it would be incredibly disingenuous to pretend that the government didn't either create or massively influence almost every single thing in our economy, with wildly schizophrenic results. The reason this episode is late is because it got too amazing, too spectacular. Actually, it got too long. So I took the 9 ways government intervenes in business and all of these awesome examples, which I think you'll love, put them after the credits. But I want to give you some of the themes that started to emerge as I looked into this. On the good side, the government is especially good at long-term investments, things that are of uncertain commercial value. You don't know if they're going to return any kind of money. The second is things that are extremely long time horizons, things that might take a decade to finish, or just expensive. And sometimes there are things that are complicated that require coordination among multiple states or jurisdictions. These are things that the private sector would never, ever touch on its own. Things like infrastructure, railroads, electricity, waterways, reservoirs, all kinds of aquatic goodies. But the stuff that I especially love is the R&D performance. DARPA, NASA, DOD, CIA, all the best acronyms have come up with some of the things that we love. Things like the internet, baby formula, GPS, and now DARPA is funding AI for $2 billion. The only problem with this is measurement. I have no idea how many GPS level innovations we should have by now based on our investment. How many astronauts we need sucking on baby bottles to invent the next baby formula. Is it 5, 55, or 555? But as a percentage of our budget, it's tiny what we invest and huge what we've gotten back. Another thing that's generally good is regulation. When done right, it works. You look at New York City's rating system for restaurants. If a restaurant gets a B or a C, you are going to lose business. People are going to go to the restaurant next door that has an A. They don't want to be riding rats and roaches to their seat. That creates an incentive for restaurants to stay clean. Even the FDA generally does an okay job. Yeah, they screw up on the food pyramid and a bunch of other stuff, but they're just as good as a lot of European regulators. And look, we're alive. Another thing the government does pretty well is facilitating markets. Even with all the bad actors, our stock market and finance system, it's still the envy of the world. Yes, we screw up a lot, but just the level of investment and free-flowing capital here, and the fact that you don't have to rely on government to do things, it is unprecedented if you travel around the world. And all of the innovations that went into getting my soothing, yelly voice into your ears right now came from this system that financed all of these startups. Another thing we do pretty well is auctions for mobile broadband. It's the best way to get the highest price for consumers and make sure that the high bidder is actually going to invest. No one's going to put in that kind of money and then go, forget it, change my mind. There are a lot of things we don't do well, and they fall under 4 major categories, although there's some others. The first is underperformance. Basically, whatever was promised wasn't delivered. The more specific the bet, the more likely it is to fail. So things like Solyndra, which was a big bomb for the Obama administration. A lot of it is because of these 2 big mismatches between who benefits and who pays. Typically, the payer is the taxpayer. It's got payer already in the word. And the beneficiaries are whoever we're paying for. So when you've got a stadium, the fans love it, the team loves it, but the taxpayers always get short shrift. The other mismatch is in terms of time period. So politicians are always incentivized to get reelected. They borrow from the future to pay for the present. So they'll sell off land, waterways, reservoirs to private companies just to close this year's budget gaps. A second way government screws up, nothing ever goes away, and it creates permanent distortions that reshape the entire economy. A lot of this stuff is baked into the tax code, which never changes. It's now millions of lines long. Things like crop and oil subsidies. These things weren't even good 90 years ago when we came up with them. A third way the government screws up is unintended consequences. No good deed goes unpunished. We wanted to help poor people get homes that they can't afford. Or we wanted to help students borrow as much money as they wanted to pay for college. All of these things have consequences, and I go into detail in the bonus section. A fourth way we screw up are the bad seeds. We spawn entire industries. The government is connected to every employer and every financial institution. We could collect taxes so easily, there shouldn't even be a form to fill out. But companies like H&R Block pay millions of dollars to lobby government to keep the tax system complex because we've created this entire industry of tax prep online or a bunch of guys sitting in weird little offices with a storefront. One of the things that sustains all of these bad seeds is the regulators are financed by the people they're supposed to be regulating. And this applies to every industry. Private prisons, All of them lobby to get more customers. So they want stricter laws. The military is especially devious at manipulating the system. Listen to the bonus section. I go into detail. Once you create something, they will make sure it never goes away if there are dollars attached. I hate to say it, but the private sector is just smarter. It is. It's smarter. It's profit driven, so it has this incentive to do things that make more money. They can afford to pay more. They're going to attract smarter people. Not necessarily better people or better human beings. They're not, but they're smarter, sometimes more devious ones that can get their way. Listen to the executive pay example in the bonus episode for a perfect illustration of this. The other thing about government is because the numbers we're talking about are so huge, it has the power to distort everything. For example, when the government says we're going to procure office supplies or services from military-owned businesses or female-owned businesses, you may value those things, but now companies are contorting themselves to meet that criteria. Otherwise, they can't supply to this huge supplier that likely will keep feeding them forever. That may not be a bad thing, but they're not necessarily adjusting their business in meaningful ways that improve society, but in cosmetic ones that improve their bottom lines. I'd love to be idealistic about this and give you this laundry list of all these opportunities. Better management and better metrics and long-term incentives. There's a ton of stuff I could list. At the end of the day, we need better people. I'm not talking about visionaries. I'll settle for people who aren't corrupt. Until we have good government, I sometimes wonder if we should have just less of it. Something more laissez-faire. Oh, I love French words. Oh, laissez-faire, it is so beautiful. The biggest opportunity I see is some regulators are clearly better than others. We can learn from them, or I'll leave that as a cliffhanger for the next episode. When you listen to all my examples, you'll realize we're all over the map when the government intervenes in business. But we're the same way with social interventions. We've had huge hits like civil rights, women's suffrage, worker safety regulations. And then we've had huge flops like mass incarceration, the drug war, poverty. And then there's others like Social Security, which is going insolvent, or the environment and education, where we're somewhere in between and edging towards failure. And we're not strangers to unintended consequences there. The Justice Department just ruled that Harvard's affirmative action policy ended up discriminating against Asian Americans. It's like taking a painkiller or antidepressant. It's not just going to address that one narrow problem. It's going to have a bunch of other effects on your body. And that's what's happening with government. And I haven't even included the daily casual incompetence that gets exposed in times of crisis. Things like the mistreatment of veterans by the VA, the Flint water crisis, or the way FEMA botched Katrina and Maria rescues. Why are they all named after women? All right, I digress. We constantly intervene and our results are wildly unpredictable. It's like every Tinder date had the possibility to either end in a fairy tale wedding or a triple homicide, where you snuff out the roommate and the neighbor. So please, somebody explain to me, I beg of you, why the people who are screaming that government is corrupt, politicians are bought off, the system is rigged, we have loads of inequality, Trump is Hitler, and all our money is wasted on the military. How are those same people in the same breath saying, we need more money, run our healthcare system, please? What in our track record that you have identified leads you to believe this is the best shepherd for this sheep? I don't believe this has to be our permanent state, but it is our reality and we have to deal with it. So it scares the hell out of me that people are so cavalier about intervening again in healthcare. Remember, it's our interventions that created this mess in the first place. Firefighters don't actually fight fire with more fire. So if we do something, If we do try to kickstart universal healthcare, as I'm about to propose in the next episode, we need to disrupt as little as possible and at a minimal additional cost. Or we could end up with a whole new set of problems. I'm going to need to do a whole other episode 10 years from now about unintended consequences. And by then it'll be too late. All of you will be dead from your shitty coverage. I'm Steve Faktor. Don't forget to rate this episode on iTunes and listen at the end of this episode for the bonus section. All of the examples in all their full glory. I'll see you next week for an episode titled Something Terrific. Okay, is everybody gone? We can now talk about the examples. Let's talk about some of the ways that government intervenes in business. The first way is by selling or licensing public property to private corporations. It started out with railroads, or at least the first big example. They were given a whole bunch of public property to go through forests and all kinds of preserves and land that the government owned to build the infrastructure. Same thing with telecoms and utilities, some of which the government gave them and some of which they leased from the railroads when railroads weren't a thing anymore. We also auction public radio spectrum, TV, radio, cell phone waves. Auctions are the best way to ensure that the public gets the highest price and that the highest bidder is actually going to invest. The good thing is, hey, we got choo-choo trains, we've got water. The bad thing is a lot of our infrastructure is terribly dated. We've got some of the worst mobile performance and speed compared to what other countries get for way less money. Now you've got Sprint and T-Mobile trying to merge. We're going to end up with one mobile network at some point if these companies continue on this path. A lot of the problem comes from us being really good at building this stuff up, but terrible at regulating it. I'm going to give this a C+. Another way we lease or license public property is for drilling rights for oil and gas on public lands, in public parks and offshore. I know there's a whole bunch of controversy about fracking. I don't want to get into the politics of it. But empirically speaking, it has made us energy independent. This is the first year that we're a net exporter of energy as opposed to importer. That's liberated us from dependence on all of these shitty regimes in the Middle East and all over the world that are now starting to reform because they're realizing that there is no future in gas. They need to modernize to compete and diversify their economies. Of course, we've also had some disasters. There's tons of pollution. There's water that you can set on fire in some parts of the country that have fracking. There's clearly environmental impact. Most of this is unsustainable. The biggest problem is the regulation is not keeping up. The people who are benefiting are not covering the total impact, which should be reflected in the price, which will create an incentive to go green. So I'm going to give this a C to C-. The second way the government intervenes is through a whole system of something called block grants, where they just give to mental health abuse clinics, National Science Foundation, to institutes of health, Head Start programs, and education and job training. A lot of this is run by states or private organizations, and in a few cases, governments. It's very hard to judge grants overall. One thing that I think we do extremely well is fund R&D. The difference between public and private funding of R&D is the government really shines at funding things that don't have a known commercial application and are extremely long-term. That's something the private sector is never going to touch. And our track record has been pretty impressive, at least on paper. The Defense Department gave us GPS, internet, microchips. NASA gave us touch screens, Goodyear tires, and baby formula. They had the decency to cut out all the pictures of John Glenn sucking through a nipple bottle in space, but it's a great invention. The NSF, which is the National Science Foundation, gave us Google. Their early research was all funded by the NSF for indexing websites. Go ahead, Google it. The National Institute of Health gave us vaccines for HPV, flu, hepatitis A and B. Is there a C? I don't know. C sounds like it would probably kill you. DARPA gave us wind energy. 6% of the energy in the US is generated by wind, some of which I'm generating now. The other thing I like about government-funded R&D is it's not subject to the whims of the stock market. MIT had this great program in the 20s for corporate-funded research. Corporations would pool all their funding into MIT, which would fund a bunch of research. I actually participated in that program when I worked at MasterCard. So we were one of the funders, and we tried to direct the research in certain ways. The problem is when the stock market crashed in 1929, all these companies pulled their capital out. The government, whether it's through intention or incompetence, leaves their money in. And that creates this long-term perspective that doesn't exist in other types of funding. I'm going to give this a solid B. And the biggest reason it didn't get anything higher is because there are no metrics. I have no idea how many GPS level innovations should have happened over the last 100 years. There's probably an argument for us making more from these innovations, but do so without stifling the purity of investing in things that are uncertain. Certainty creates short-sightedness. Another type of grant are private stadiums for sports teams. These have never, ever, ever made the money that was promised. And there is some possibility that there are intangibles we're not calculating. For example, if you've got some podunk town and your team kind of travels from city to city as an ambassador for your existence, I don't know how to put a value on it. I'm going to give this a C because the team benefits and the fans benefit, but not the overall taxpayers. A third way the government intervenes is by giving loans to private enterprise. This is different than grants because now we expect a return with interest on our investment. One example is this Department of Energy program that was created by the Bush administration to fund huge electric plants and upgrades to the electric grid. And then the Obama administration added green energy to it. Their biggest investment was a huge flop that became a political issue. Solyndra was a solar panel company, but shortly after our investment, competing technologies dropped their cost by 89%. So their entire technology was made obsolete almost instantaneously. That same program also funded Elon Musk's ventures, Tesla, SpaceX, and Solar City. Tesla even returned its money 9 years early. This is a pretty high-risk program, and some might argue that the government shouldn't be in this business or in the business of investing, which we're not necessarily great at. Also, a lot of the benefit is privatized. We're getting some interest, but we're taking on a whole lot of risk. I'm going to give it a C for underperformance. Another way the government intervenes, the fourth way, is through guarantees and insurance. Instead of giving a direct loan, they're just backing things in case the lender or whoever it is screws up. The biggest example is in your bank account, FDIC insurance. That happened after the stock market crash in 1929. People didn't trust the banks. They were going out of business. So people pulled all their money. The government didn't want this crazy mayhem. So in 1932, they created this deposit insurance program, which has a lot of benefits. It gives people trust in the banking system. It keeps money and cash off the black market. So it's above ground. It could be taxed. You can monitor transfers and transactions. I know a bunch of libertarians are going to give me crap for that. I don't care. There's a downside to all of this trust. A lot of it is false trust. It makes us look the other way when these companies are taking huge gambles with our money. And it left taxpayers holding the bag when all these banks went bankrupt in the last recession, and then before that during the S&L scandal, and before that during the Great Depression. Surprisingly, I'm going to give this a B-. Overall, I think this is a good thing for us to have, even with those risks. Another way we guarantee things, and this one, spoiler alert, is going to get a crappy score. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were created for noble causes. We want people to have college degrees. We want people to own homes. That's awesome. The problem with that is when you create a guarantee with no limit, that's going to drive prices up. The reason we have education at the cost that it is, $60,000 a year or something at some of these universities, is because they can. They know that you have no place to go. They've lobbied to make sure, the banks and the universities, that you can't go bankrupt on student loans. So you're going to pay that for the rest of your life. And they're going to keep raising the price because the government is standing there backing all that stuff. We have created this problem through government. The second thing is home loans. We know what happened there in 2008. Freddie Mac basically said, hey, take out all these loans, no problem. If these people can't pay, we'll back it. 50 years ago, you could finance a home with a 15-year mortgage on one salary. Now it's 30-year mortgages, and you've got to have both people working. You got to put the kids to work. You got to get the dog to pull the plow. It's insane. This was one of the biggest causes for the Great Recession. It's getting an F for unintended consequences and corrupting our system. The fifth way the government intervenes in business is through incentives, a lot of which are tax credits or deductions. We've had credits for solar panels, installing them on your house, as well as buying green cars. On the surface, that looks great, but that's money the government is not receiving. What else could we do with that money? I'm not sure that government credits are the best way for us to go green. California is the most advanced in pushing all of these incentives. The problem is they've got homeless all over California. People are being priced out of their homes, partially because of the other problem that we've guaranteed loans. You're not taking in as much money to address a whole bunch of other problems and infrastructure issues that we have. Plus, this entire enterprise is extremely regressive. It's a cause of inequality because you're giving all of these incentives to rich people who can afford a Prius, who can afford to install solar panels, not renters. Not great. C- for unintended consequences. A lot of people talk about oil and farm subsidies, and I'm one of them. They are a terrible idea because they've never gone away. They've festered forever. After World War I, when 70% of this country was agrarian, we set up this price floor for grains and crops. And on some level, that makes sense because it is strategic to be able to grow your own food. That means if there's a war or a trade war, not that something crazy like that would ever happen, it's nice to know you can get food from within your own country. Same thing with oil. It was logical then. I'm not so sure it's logical now. Subsidizing all of these crops like corn and wheat changes our diet. It creates an overabundance of these things. You go through the typical aisle at Walmart, you're going to see only subsidized crops, different permutations of corn syrup and corn and wheat. And that's why we're fat. That's why I have to fast 2 days a week. It creates all this cheap food, and why not? Grab a bag of chips. Another effect of these programs is global warming. If you're going to prop up the fossil fuel industry, they're going to keep fighting to exist, festering way longer than they should. I'm giving this a C-. Another way we do incentives is look at all of your savings account, the 401k, the IRA, the HSA, FSA. Is there anything that doesn't end with A? All of these plans are also extremely regressive. On one hand, yeah, it's great that we're incentivizing people to save, but we're compensating for social programs that don't exist anymore. And the very creator of the 401k plan says that he regrets inventing it. It was never meant to be your entire pension. It was supposed to be this supplementary thing. But what companies did was immediately get rid of all of the pension plans. Now 401k is all you've got. And it's also driving inequality because the people who get to benefit are the people who can afford to save, which is only about 50% of the population. And it's a huge wealth transfer to financial services companies. The reason all these employers don't pay a penny for these plans is all the high fees are buried in the crummy funds you have to buy We don't need this. People should be taught to save without this laundering scheme. I'm going to give this one a D for creating a bunch of administrative nonsense for us to manage with no benefit to anybody except financial services companies. Another incentive the government does is something called tax abatements, which is basically giving companies a bunch of tax breaks in order to come to their city or their state. And these never pay off. Apple got a $321 million subsidy from North Carolina to build a data center. It only created 50 jobs. Each job costed taxpayers $6.4 million in incentives. That's insane. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got United Technology, which got $400 million in subsidies to stay in Connecticut. Their 18,000 jobs only cost $22,000 per job. Tesla got $1.3 billion in subsidies by Nevada to build their gigafactory. Each of the 6,500 jobs cost $198,000. We're not getting bang for the buck. And right this very second, all of these pathetic cities and states are begging Amazon to show up on their doorstep. Newark, which does not have a pot to piss in. The crime rate is off the charts. The schools are terrible. Public transportation is a wreck. They found $7 billion in incentives, which would be the largest deal to date to get Amazon over there. This is a parasitic race to the bottom. I'm going to give this a D+. Why the plus? Because I think it's a little bit extra insulting. It's like the D+ I once got in my calculus class. Steve, you haven't answered a single question correct, but I love those jokes. Keep them coming. Our tax system in general is full of distortions. It's got millions of lines. It is packed with proposals that shape and form our entire society. It's pro-marriage. It's pro-home ownership. It's pro having more kids. It's pro-military service. Now, you could argue those are important values, or maybe you don't like incentivizing those values. But why are they baked into our tax system? Wouldn't it be more honest to channel those incentives through programs that support those things rather than forcing us to have this thing that never changes baked into our tax code? This gets a D for unintended consequences. The sixth way the government intervenes is as a regulator. Look at what happened with HealthCare. I already gave this example in the last episode, but it's worth touching on. During the World War II labor shortage, Roosevelt said, hey, we don't want to have inflation, so we don't want companies trying to poach each other's workers. We're going to ban competing on salary. Great on paper, but companies being motivated by profit are smarter. They started competing on benefits. The biggest benefit was healthcare, which spawned our current system. You would think that would have been an amazing lesson to learn. Oh no. During the Clinton administration, they did the same exact thing. Some bureaucrat saw that executive pay was outpacing pay for employees. I looked at this chart. It was going up at a higher rate, but it was kind of a linear increase. What government said was, you've got to lower executive pay. And companies did exactly that. Guess what they replaced salary with? Options and stocks. Right when that policy was implemented, you can see the spike in executive compensation. It just went through the roof because the value of the stock market is not linear like salaries are. So they created this executive pay gap that everyone's talking about. This gets an F for unintended consequences and for not learning their lesson from Roosevelt. Clinton did not stop there. By the way, I'm not just bagging on Clinton. He did some good stuff, but a lot of the stuff he did caused the recession. A perfect example was mandating private lending to unqualified borrowers. So the Department of Housing and Urban Development encouraged lenders to give to people who are unqualified for loans. Of course, poor people should have homes, but they should have homes because they're not poor, because they can afford homes and have good credit, not because you decided to give them something they can't afford. That was one of the biggest contributors to the recession. F for unintended consequences. A seventh way the government intervenes is through bailouts. It rescues entire industries sometimes. The Great Recession was a crisis. The government decided, it was a combination of the Bush and the Obama administration, to prop up the auto industry and the big banks in order to keep most of them from failing. It worked out great for the auto industry. All those people are still employed. The companies are thriving. But with the banks, you could argue the too big to fail got bigger and likelier to fail. It's very tough to come down super hard on this because crisis situations are all different. You don't know in the heat of the moment exactly what to do. Those banks did repay their loans, even though they've got a bunch of handouts. So I'm going to give this a B-, points deducted for the bad seeds that were encouraged by this and the unintended consequences that happened and will happen in the next recession. An eighth way the government intervenes with the private sector is by buying private services. Let's use this one example, the private prison industry. This goes back to the American Revolution. The big problem that we're experiencing now sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's actually true. During the Nixon administration, they targeted blacks and hippies with drug-related incarceration. They demonized them systematically, put them away. Then Clinton kind of doubled down on it. This war on drugs and Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. Wow, does that roll off the tongue? That sent a ton of black kids into prisons. On top of that, a lot of these prisons that have been outsourced have prison labor. That's what helps sustain the economics of these things. We've got this really awful thing on our hands, and it costs the taxpayers a fortune. Plus, these companies continue to lobby for tougher laws, which give them more customers. I'm giving this an F for creating all of these bad seeds. The biggest service that we buy are military contracts. And we've got a ton of crap that the military doesn't even want. We made a bunch of tanks that generals said, oh no, no tanks. They didn't want them. We still made them because we had those contracts. The Joint Strike Fighter has been a disaster. Over a decade, we've spent $1 trillion on this thing. This thing gets beaten by planes that were designed and built in the 60s, like the F-16. It is a complete turd that we should have canceled, but it keeps going. These companies will continue to perpetuate this, and they are geniuses. They spread their operations across 43 different states. So now all of these senators are like, well, I don't want to lose jobs in my state. The other thing that happens is they hire all of these generals. These guys know their private sector opportunity is going to come from this sector. It's this vicious cycle of feeding this military-industrial complex. And guess what? We have to have wars in this reality because you have to get rid of inventory. You can't store an infinite number of rockets or explosives or guns or anything else. You need to clear the stock rooms. You need to clear the inventory. The way to do that is war. This gets an F for gross underperformance and for the most devious creation of bad seeds. Number 9, the way the government also affects business is as a direct administrator and builder of infrastructure. Airports and bridges and highways, all of those things were built by government. Yeah, the government gave contracts to private companies to build them, but they managed the infrastructure day to day. What's the conversation everyone's having right now? Our infrastructure is falling apart. You go to China, you go to Shanghai, and you look at the airports like stepping into the future. You go to JFK, and the best you can do is a Shake Shack burger, and don't look up because the rest of it will depress you because your flight is late. That's why you're eating the burger. On the basis of underperformance, I'm going to give us a C. There is one positive I should mention. Our expenses have been pretty constant for the last 30 years, even though you could argue we should have spent a little bit more to fix up some of these things. I can go on forever. There are tons of examples. That's it. I'm Steve Faktor. Don't forget, if you enjoyed this, rate it 5 stars on iTunes, tell a friend, share it online, and I don't know, send me something delicious in the mail. See you next week.